So we'll move on into our coaching volleyball session through COVID. And I'd just like to once again welcome you. So those who didn't hear the welcome at the start, welcome to our coaching session through volleyball, through COVID. So is the next slide for you, Stuart?
Yes, that's right. That's me. I'll jump in as long as
what we're doing. Thank you. Over to you.
That's fine. So just a few housekeeping rules. Apologies, I probably should have put this slide right at the start before the briefing. But just a few very basic rules. To avoid interference with mics, you've probably already noticed that you are muted or you will be muted. And if you can just keep your mics muted, that would be fantastic, just so we don't get any interference there. There will be 4 presentations, and then there's an opportunity for a question and answer at the end. So if you want to drop your questions in the chat as we go along, or wait till the end, and then we can do a sort of similar question and answer as we did just now with the hands up, and that'd be great. We've not had any issues with the webinars we've had so far. I don't anticipate we will tonight, but if you just be respectful to each other, and if you end up spamming the chat or something like that, we do reserve the rights to remove people from the webinar. And then finally, this session is being recorded, so the briefing will be available as a separate video, and then this will also be uploaded to our YouTube channels. And the presentation, and as Sue mentioned, sort of the questions from this will be answered and put on the website as well. So, and there'll be plenty of information at the end of this. And just a quick run through then of the schedule. We shared some details ahead of this. It's going to start with a bit of an introduction on the rules then from Sue Storey, our CEO, and Richard Harrison, a board member and former coaches commissioner. James Murphy's then going to do a little session on training ideas for your volleybubbles. James is obviously our competitions working group lead. Brendan Fogarty is going to talk us through some top tips for completing your risk assessments. Brendan is also part of our board, and he is a health and safety manager in his day job. And then our final session is going to be led by Nick Shaffery, and that's going to all be about capitalising on this opportunity to promote volleyball at the moment. And Nick, as many of you will know, is our children and young people lead. And then the final 2 sections are Q&A, and then just a few closing remarks. So without further ado, on to you, Dennis. Okay, Sue? Oh, I think you're still muted. Sorry, Sue.
Still muted. Apologies. I think I'd have learnt it by now. Apologies, guys. So just go through the rules. As we've already just talked about, the first thing for everybody to check is what is the COVID alert level for the area where the activity is actually taking place. And that is quite an important part. It's not, it is where the activity is taking place. So organised indoor volleyball in areas that are in tier 2 is not exempt from the rule. Organised indoor volleyball in tier 1 is not exempt from the rule of 6. Therefore, it can only be played. It cannot be played with more than 6 adults. So what we wanted to do is sort of give some ideas and thoughts about how that could usefully be done and how we can help that. So there are exemptions that apply, as we've already talked about in the first part of this. There's an exemption for children under the age of 18. Such events, they can't exceed 30 people, but there's no limit on the number of adults who can be present within that 30. But they cannot play, but they can take part in terms of they can feed balls, etc., as we said earlier. But you can't have a situation where you have 6 adults and 6 children playing a match. The role of the adults that are organising the sessions is to coach or to feed balls, etc., or take part in overseeing safeguarding activity. Other exemptions for disabled people, and this is, although our sitting volleyball return to play plans have not yet received the green light, we are working really, really hard to try and get that through as soon as possible. But there is an exemption from the rule of 6 for disabled people, and that is for disabled people, not for the disabled sport. So the sport itself is not exempt, it's just disabled people playing in that sport. So if you had sort of 2 non-disabled people in a sitting volleyball team, then that team would have to comply with the rule of 6. If all the players on both sides were disabled, then they would be able to play as a group of 12 once we've got our return to play plans approved. And also students who are over the ages of 18, but in an educational establishment, education purposes, they are also exempt from this rule. You can have multiple bubbles in a sports hall. So some of the examples we'll show shortly is around coaching ideas when you've got more than one bubble in either on a court or on more than one court. So that's good news. So a coach in an adult session can be in a separate bubble. So that does give some flexibility around having bubbles, but you have got to make sure that they do not share equipment and do not share the ball and must remain at least 2 meters apart. And I think just to reaffirm, we've said this a few times, but the guidance on this should be followed in terms of government guidance comes first, then venue guidance in terms of venue risk assessments and so on, then our guidance, and then your own club risk assessment. So making sure that you tick all of those boxes is quite a key part to all of this. Hope that makes sense. And without further ado, we'll move on to Richard next.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Richard Harrison. I'll be talking you through the return to training guidance for Volleyball England coaches. Stuart, if you could just bring up the slides, please.
Can you see the slides on your screen, Richard? I'm just currently on your return to training guide.
All I can see is indoor volleyball.
Oh, is it zoomed in? Can everybody else see the full screen, or is it? I think it might be screen size, Richard. So I'm on the first slide now. Do you want me to proceed to the second one?
Right. Well, I'm going to do this blind, am I? Please go to the second one, slide number 2.
No worries. There we are.
Right. Good. No, sorry. Slide back to the previous slide. I can see now. Right. Yeah, just to clarify that we've produced a return to training guidance document, but we'll amend this and release it following any feedback from this presentation, your questions, and any suggestions that you might have. And I've based the guidance on information from Volleyball Canada, USA Volleyball, Sport England, and from SimSpa. Whether it's for the rule of 6 or 30, the guidance provides a framework for you to engage with both the players and the areas that you really need to look into as coaches, and to help you in the planning and delivery of your training sessions, focusing on the safety and well-being of your players. Next slide, please, Stuart.
There we go. Yeah, it's on the...
Yeah. Looking at the point, yeah, I can see. Thank you. Looking at the points in the slide, if you look at them closely, these are the things that we normally do as coaches. But COVID-19 has created a new situation in which we will all have to reshape the way we do things in relation to our players, the facility, and how we use it, particularly in relation to social distancing. So it means that we have to spend a little bit more time in planning, control, to mitigate and manage risk, including a review and evaluation of the session, just to keep on track, to keep everything safe and effective. And through each of the slides, I'll cover them in individual detail. If you'd like to move to the next slide, please, Stuart. So for the first one, player expectations and communicating expectations. So I'm suggesting that you have a communication strategy in regard to COVID-19 for pre-training, reinforcement during your training sessions, and afterwards. You're planning for at least one person being asymptomatic in the group that you're coaching. So you should have an initial communication to make all your players aware of the increase in transmission risk associated with training even in accordance with the Volleyball England and individual club action plans. And just to ensure that everybody is clear that they're opting to participate in volleyball activity. Remember, these are unusual at uncertain times. So players might have fears about the virus. They've probably got job insecurity. They might have family pressures. So in this two-way process of communication, just acknowledge your players' fears and emotions. They obviously want to get to play volleyball, but you're going to help them overcoming any difficulties and make it easier for them to transition into playing and training. Some players might not want to participate. So even when it comes to competition time, you might find some players not wanting to play. So you've got to try and generate this idea of respect in your players for any individual choices they might make. You might want to see who's interested in training at home, still want to be engaged with the club when things come back to normal, but you might want to do or provide information for individual training or just any activity to keep them engaged with the club or with volleyball in general. So keep in contact with your players. And for junior players, don't forget about parents. Remember, parents have a vital role in getting their children to training sessions, competitions, and being their biggest supporters. So they can see the effect that the pandemic has on their children. Their children have been out of school. They probably want to be active. So just try and get some information from parents and what the needs of their children might be. And finally, players who make a commitment to train have also got responsibilities to their teammates. So this includes understanding that their playing group becomes a social bubble, and players should therefore avoid or reduce contact with groups in other social settings. So the next factor, facility guidelines and use of space. So this is all about mitigating risk in the use of space in the training facility on and off the court. All coaches and participants should know and follow the guidelines for the facility they're training in. This is what I meant about the pre-communication. Make it easy for players to turn up and understand what they need to do when they get there. Each facility should have rules about entry and flow. They should have a comprehensive risk assessment. You might not be able to get hold of it, but you might want to just to investigate the information that they're prepared to give you at least, and you can go in early to see just what the protocols are in the facility. And if you prepare your players in advance, you might find out that there might be a separate entrance to an exit. Will they need masks in reception? What are the rules about the use of the facility volleyball equipment? Where should they dispose of all the rubbish, including wipes? So as a coach within the session, we're monitoring the use of space in the hall and help maintain their behaviour according to the facility guidelines, including social distancing as much as possible during the course of the session, or adjust practices or the pace of the activity to make it safer. So we're constantly looking at what's going on and making changes as necessary. Now, I recommend that the coach stays out of the playing area. According to Sport England, you can be involved and be 2 meters apart from the players, but I would recommend that you just stay outside of the court. In Scotland, for example, they insist on you wearing a face mask if you need to wear one. And remember, for briefings and for feedback, for drinks breaks, maintain the 2 meter distance from the players and between each of the players. So for your session planning and design, there's got to be a little bit more careful consideration in what you do during the session. And that includes communication, positioning yourself and where the players should be. Keep observing player behaviour. Reinforce what they're doing well during the session. In the session introduction, inform participants, so your players, of general hygiene, the safety precautions during the session, and ensure these guidelines are followed throughout the activity. Take steps to avoid raising your voice. There is an increased risk of airborne droplet and aerosol transmission from shouting. For example, you could use an electronic whistle to stop the group and use this as a signal to bring the players to you. And remember, plans can be adapted. So during the session and afterwards, you can review what's happening and what has happened and change your approach. Thanks, Stuart. So for the risk assessment and emergency action plan, Brendan will give you some top tips later on, but obviously coaches should complete a risk assessment prior to the session. And there is a template on the Volleyball England website. You've obviously kept a register for your training sessions, but there is an additional responsibility to keep the names and phone numbers for track and trace purposes for each training session and in the future for each game you play. These records must be kept for 21 days after each of your recorded events. That's for each of the training sessions. And you may also be collecting health-related information, including underlying health conditions, whether they are experiencing coronavirus symptoms or the results of a test. So it's still important to collect information according to your club's general data protection regulation policy and ensure that any information you have related to your players is secure and safeguarded. Now, I mentioned an emergency action plan because obviously facility protocols might change. For example, in the event of a fire, have those changed? Are the exits different? Is the means of exit different? So I recommend that you try and find out about that. And who provides first aid? Is it your team first aider or do you go to the facility first aider? If it's your team first aider, are they trained or do they understand COVID-19 procedures? If not, there is advice available from the St John's Ambulance website. So just try and understand what differences there are in terms of the emergency action plan if you have an accident or if there's an emergency in the facility. So as we normally do following a training session or at the end of the season, review and evaluate. And remember, the guidance is about providing a new focus of risk mitigation. And it's almost like learning a new behavior as a coach because you're reshaping and re-emphasizing what we already do as coaches, and we're thinking a little bit more about what we do. And it's all about ensuring that our players have a safe and enjoyable experience. So we could look at all the elements that we've covered, such as communication, using the facility guidelines, using space, maintaining social distancing, your session planning and design, and how the players responded. You might begin by asking your players at the end of the session how it went, but reinforce and continue what was effective during your session. Even review your risk assessment and make any necessary changes for your future plans. Continue to monitor national and local guidelines and restrictions because, as we've found out, they can change really quickly. You can move in and out of various restrictions, and some of your players might be from different areas and they could be subject to different rules. So, in summary, as I said at the beginning, it's all about the safety and well-being of your players through engagement with your players and the rules, regulations and protocols as they change. Thanks, Stuart.
Thank you very much, Richard. So I think we're now going to the next section. It's just James Murphy and it's sort of ideas for your volleybubbles, the term that we've recently coined.
Thanks very much, Stuart and Richard. So just first of all, a couple of slides as a reminder of what we've already published on the VE website. This one is 2 bubbles of 6 on either side of the net. Each bubble can only interact amongst that bubble. Next slide. This slide shows how you can interact over the net. Again, participants can only interact amongst the bubble. Next slide. If you're fortunate enough to have a long net and 4 badminton courts, you can have a bubble on each court. Next slide. Right, the next set of slides total up to a 2-hour training session. I'm not going to go through in detail, as you can see all of the slides after the webinar. As Richard said, remember, you as coaches set the tone for the session. We want everybody to be safe, and that's why we have to follow this guidance. As we said before, if you've got any questions about any of this, if you record them in the chat, then we'll catch them in the Q&A at the end. And this slide's really about just a quick dynamic warm-up without a ball. Next slide. This one is a dynamic warm-up with the ball. Next slide. This one goes into a serving drill. Now, this set of activities is very much an example, and you need to adapt it for your own club players with appropriate risk assessment. So taking this as an example, if in this situation you don't feel that your players can either serve accurately or that the receivers won't close the gap, then you could do something as simple as taking out one of the receivers, so there's only one receiver, so you make sure you keep that 2 meters. It's really important that you design the activity to ensure that 2 meter separation at all times. Obviously make it as game-like as possible, but also remove any random elements that would allow that 2 meter gap to close. So one of the questions that keeps coming up is, can players be closer than 2 meters in a drill? The answer is no. The coach must design the drills to prevent this. Next slide. This is a hitting one. Again, not much more to say on this. One thing you probably notice on the left, I've said water and sanitized break. It's really important that you have those breaks in there. Maximum of 20 minutes. In this one, there's no more than 15 minutes without a sanitized break. Next slide. One last thing to say, actually, sorry, on that previous slide. What happens if a ball crosses between bubbles? Well, as long as there is no contact with the hands, then there's no problem at all. You can just carry on. If, however, for example, a player from bubble B touches a ball with their hands, then the player should step out, sanitize their hands, wipe the ball down, and then they can carry on. The rest of the drill should carry on. There's no need to stop. It's just that player and that ball. You will find very, very quickly that players learn, don't catch a ball from another bubble, and that problem goes away quite quickly. So next slide. So yes, gameplay is still allowed. You can do 3v3, but it is the absolute maximum. You cannot have more than 3v3 at this time. Can players be closer than 2 meters in a 3v3 game? Yes, absolutely. As long as the time is fleeting, i.e. less than 3 seconds, and less than 15 minutes cumulative for the session. And again, we've done the analysis on this. It's not a problem playing a game. You will not normally be within 2 meters of people for more than 3 seconds or 15 minutes cumulative. So next slide. This one is just about how you transition between the 2 games. So in this case, Bubble A has just been playing, will be cooling down, and Bubble B will be warming up. Next one. This is the 3v3 for Bubble B. And then next slide, finally, you have a cool down for Bubble B. Now, obviously, in this scenario, I've had quite restricted court space. If there's a bit more room, then obviously the other bubble could be playing off court as long as there's enough room. And that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. Some good detailing on the presentation. Brendan, I think you're next on sort of the top tips for risk assessments. I'm afraid to say, Brendan, you're muted. It's always going to happen. He's still muted. Can you find it in that top right-hand corner, Brendan? Is it allowing you to unmute yourself? I don't know. You should be, if it's not at the top bar, there should be a bar at the bottom with just a little microphone symbol. I don't think I can overrule it myself, I'm afraid.
I thought we'd done quite well not to have any technical difficulties tonight, so we're bound to have one at some point during the evening. So,
if it's okay, then Brendan, I'm going to skip through to Nick's section and see if we can manage to unmute in the meanwhile, and then skip back. I'm afraid I can't find any other way than just going right through the slides, but so you have to close your eyes at this section, so don't ruin any secrets. Right, Nick, are you okay to step in at this point?
Yes, if you can hear me.
Yes.
You need to go back. Let's keep going.
Got a bit carried away there. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Nick. Thank you very much, Nick.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. It's great to have this opportunity to talk about children and young people getting involved during these challenging times. I've got 4 areas to briefly outline, and apologies if I'm stating the obvious, but hopefully there'll be 1 or 2 things we can take away from there. So we're looking at the opportunities to develop junior players in your club, the practicalities, Volley2s is just a new resource which hopefully will help you establish youngsters in your club, and then a few things about competitions this year. The first thing I've got to say is this is an excellent opportunity to develop our young players, as we've found out to our cost that under 18s are the only ones that are able to train, if you like, as they would before. So it's a great opportunity to develop our youngsters and actually recruit new ones. Second point is it's a little bit scary thinking of coaching a group. If you've never done one before, it is a bit scary, but if you get everything in place, particularly with the COVID restrictions, it will work and it will be very, very rewarding. And the third thing is, which I think Richard touched on a little bit, is we've got to learn to coach again. So particularly with juniors, it's about shouting, it's about moving, it's about gathering people in, it's about enthusing, high fives. Sorry, all that's got to change a little bit. And I've managed to run 2 evenings so far with 3 little sessions in each of the evenings. And only now am I thinking about what I'm going to coach rather than what I'm going to disinfect. So these sort of things are going to take time, but if you stick to it, it's going to work. Looking at this slide here, about opportunities, the first thing is that we may have to keep our venue and still be having to maybe pay for it. So why not get juniors involved? And it is an excellent opportunity to get them playing. If I was starting a new session and it was £40 an hour, 10 kids coming along, they pay £4. There you go, you've covered the cost. A little bit more will help towards new equipment or whatever else you need to do. I've put down there about schools. At the moment, schools will not be having inter-school competitions. There may well be not much happening after school in after school clubs. So again, it's an opportunity for us for volleyball to try and step in and say, you know, we have got a club, we can run things. Are there people in your school, students in your school under 18 who'd like to come along and take part? Within your area, you've got somebody called a school games organizer, which oversees sport in schools right across your area. If you were to look that up, they're the sort of people that like to help you out with this. One little tip is don't advertise your club and say, come along and have a go. It has to be invited, so that they need to tell you they're keen, and then you need to tell them when the sessions are taking place. Onto the rule of 30, which we've been talking about quite a lot. My advice here is that keep numbers as low as you possibly can and then build them up. If you've got a 4 badminton court playing 3 against 3, that gives you 24 kids. That's just miles too many to start with. You've also got your coaches involved as well. But I'd start with lower numbers and build up. In my club, we have 2 1.5-hour sessions. I've now changed that, so we've got 3 50-minute sessions, which allows change over time. But it's also meant that the numbers are low, which we're able to build up again. So that would be one of my tips. So you start to get the idea of how to coach in these different times, which is really important. Involving over 18s, these are the ones I feel really sorry for. I know Ian was mentioning about what happens to these when they turn 18. It's difficult for adults, but for these kids who are used to playing with their mates and then can't, they may well want to be involved with some of the coaching, and it's an excellent opportunity to get them to do that. It then can lead them into taking their level 1s and other coaching qualifications later on. It could be that for A levels and BTECs, etc., coaching is one of the elements that they need to be assessed on. Again, this is an excellent opportunity to get them involved. Plus, it's extra pair of hands and role models, if you like, for the younger ones coming through. Thanks, Stuart. Next one, please. Right, this is all about a little bit about the practicalities. James mentioned about equipment and about using a long net. So the thing about coaching juniors, we've usually had loads and loads of equipment, tennis balls and markers and what have you. You've really got to cut that out and down to just a ball or balls and a net through, because you've got to then clean all of these, disinfect them, check everything's right. So limit what you've got in terms of equipment. If you can put a net lengthways, that is superb with attaching it at each end. This gives you lots of opportunities to play cross court. That was in James's diagram with the badminton courts. If you're involving younger players under 11s, look for a ball that is appropriate for them. So there's the SK V5 or the Mikassa's V180. That sort of weight of ball, not using the traditional ones that you use if these children are under 11. So that's a health and safety thing around the care of them when they're playing at that particular age. The section says volleyball, make easy for players and coaches. If you haven't coached youngsters, the one thing is make it fun, make it attractive to them, get them playing games, and it won't necessarily look like volleyball to start with. But they're coming along, a ball is going over a net, they're actually playing volleyball, and then you can build up from there. So they'll have a short space of time, so make it as active, so they're moving and making the activities enjoyable. The bit about protocols and procedures is really important. I think all of those have been gone through, and we'll be going through again on that. The one thing I'd say there is that children understand and know better than you. They've been to school for a few weeks, and therefore they've been marching up and down corridors in one direction and doing this and doing that. So when it comes to your training session, they will be used to things. Don't think that it's going to be difficult for them to understand these new set of rules, because the rules are already there, and that's really important. One thing I found useful, as well as doing a risk assessment, was also to have a sort of emailed letter to parents to tell them what's going to happen, sort of play a pathway. What happens before they arrive? Have they got with them their face mask? Have they got their named water bottle? Have they got their spare t-shirt in case it gets hot and sweaty, etc.? What happens when they arrive? What happens about registration? What happens in the sports hall during the session? What happens if they want to go to the toilet in terms of going there and then coming back into the sports area? What happens there? What about departure? And also paying for sessions. It's much better being online. Handling cash is not a great idea. So that sort of information in a nice straight line seemed to be very useful to parents. And then the last two are about communication and parents and carers. If you're working with under 18s, it takes a lot longer than if you're just working with adults. So just be aware that it takes a while for all the information to go to parents and the forms to be filled in and to come back and check that all that is in place. And you also do need a quick and easy way to inform parents that sessions have changed. They might be called off at the last minute. Times might be changed. Certain things might happen. It's got to be quick and easy. It's okay if you're an adult and you turn up and the sessions is cancelled, you hop back in your car and go home. It's not quite that simple for young people. So just be aware of that. And also be aware of children being in school isolation bubbles. They shouldn't be attending your session at all. They probably think it's, you know, I'm away from school, but then this is different. It isn't. If you'd like to on to the next slide, Stuart, please. For those people who haven't started any volleyball with younger ones, it may well be that this is the answer to your prayers as such, because about 2 years ago we had a first meeting of coaches who were very, very keen to develop volleyball. I think probably quite a few of you are listening in at the moment. The two main points that came out of this was that volleyball competition starts when they can play proper volleyball, which is usually about 13. It's a little bit like saying don't go to the swimming baths unless you can swim. So we wanted to do something about that. And the second thing is those who could nearly play were failing, and they were being constantly reminded by coaches they had failed. So the expression of, "Oh, referee, that was a bit of a catch, wasn't it?" That was sort of putting our players off. We needed to do something. So the group helped us to shape this new Volley 2s, which is a 2v2 game. It's aimed at 7 to 11-year-olds, but it can extend beyond that. There are 4 stages: red, amber, green and gold, as you can see, starting with a catch throw game at red, and this leads through at gold to the traditional skills with a dig, set, spike and serve. So it's got the full range of skills at the gold level. This means that competitions can be based on a stage. So you would advertise that you can play a competition. It's a green competition and everyone knows the rules, and they've been adapted so that everyone's supportive of that. And also we've developed from this a resource, a teachers and coaches resource, and it gives practical practices for each stage. So if you move the next one, just a little highlight to show you what's within the resource, Stuart. There are sections to show you how to play Volley 2. So on the left, for each of the sections, that's the old one. On the left, you can see that there's ways to play, organisation, and the rules for that particular stage. And then on the right-hand side, you can see that there's diagrams about how the activities are played. So if you take the left-hand one and then match it to the right-hand one, that will give you a complete idea of the rules within that particular game and how it's played. Next one, please, Stu. And also within this, there's the development activity and technical cards. So for each stage, there on the left is the sort of index for that section, and there are 15 practices, and there's warm-ups and cool-down activity specific for that particular stage. The middle one is an example of one of the cards from the red section, so it gives you the name of the activity. Then it tells you how to play it, what equipment is needed, how you can differentiate it, make it easier, make it harder. So that's just one of the 15 cards for red. You'll notice on the left-hand side at the bottom, it says social and volleyball behaviours. So it gives you some ideas about what we should be looking for in terms of playing within a team, as an individual. The bottom bit is highlighted in green because it actually says one of the things that should be happening is shaking hands with your opponent and the officials at the end of each match. So we've had to change the shaking hands, and it will now say thank your opponents. So you can see that it's in a draft form at the moment, and it keeps getting changed and COVID all affected as we go along. On the right hand side, we've got a series of technical cards that gives you little bits of advice around all the different shots, dig, set, spike, tip, block, as well as the ones that you can see there. So that gives you a real technical idea of how things work. Next, please, Stu. Also within the guide, there's an inclusion and differentiation stage. It is 2v2, but this has been designed so that you can actually play sitting volleyball. You can play with people with various disabilities. You could play a game with a wheelchair user and an ambient person. So you can mix things around. You are able to play with people perhaps playing red stage on one side of the net, and then on the other side of the net there might be green. I think James in Yorkshire has actually done that and found it most successful and challenging to both sides of the net, which has been great. There's a guide as well to give you ideas about if you set up a little festival, competition between either within your club or against 2 or 3 other clubs. So there's lots of advice there, simple refereeing, because it's great to get the people, the children involved in that aspect as well. Next bit, please. Sorry, I'm whizzing through this. And the final bits that are in the pack: equipment and advice on the nets, as we can see there, and types of nets, the volleyballs that you should be using. There's also advice on planning sessions, managing sessions, warm-ups, cool-downs. And on the right-hand side, underpinning all of this is the volleyball fundamentals framework, with the ready for action, right time, right place, ball control, finish and link, which is something all coaches should be familiar with. For those who've gone through level 1, 2, 3, this sort of underpins everything. And particularly on the technical cards, it underpins the technical cards as well. So hopefully this resource is coming out really soon. It keeps getting delayed little bits, and COVID has certainly not helped that. But when it's out, we're hoping that people can take it and use it and introduce it into the schools as well, by taking it to their local school and say, hey, volleyball's not a bad game, fancy having a go at it, here's a resource to help you along. So that's volley twos. And the last bit, I'm speaking as fast as possible, competitions this year has been a real challenge, and as Jonathan, James, Di, Howard, Pete and myself have been involved for many months, right in the middle of the proper lockdown ages ago. What are we going to do for this particular season with all the things that might happen, which are obviously coming to fruition now? And we had 3 main things. We wanted to keep young people playing. That was the first one. We needed fairness, and we also needed challenge. So the way that we were looking at this, and again, this is a work in progress, but national age group Grand Prix events, which means that there will be standalone events. So if we were to stick to the traditional cup, it could be that the first round we couldn't get there because we were restricted through COVID, therefore we're knocked out. Well, that's not fair, because we were national champions last year. So we had to find something that was going to be fair right across the board. So that's what we're looking at the moment. The idea of challenge is a 2-tier system. So teams that traditionally sort of last 8 would want to be in tier 1. Tier 2 is to try and encourage as many beginners as well as less experienced teams to be involved, so that they would compete against similar ability. We're looking to localize things, particularly on the transport. So last year it was 5 in a car. This year it's 5 cars to get to an event. So we try to localize that. We're also at the moment seeing the possibilities of a tier 1 of one of the tier 1 events at Kettering's National Volleyball Centre. And again, that's a work in progress. And finally, on that bit, the player registration, we want players to be involved and feel part of Volleyball England. And obviously a registration fee last year was £15, which was not great. So we've managed to get that to £5, which I think is much fairer and involves everyone. So that's where we've got to on competitions. As I say, hopefully an entry form will be out soon. We'll be looking for people who can host some of these events, obviously with the bit written underneath that says we can cancel at any moment because of the situation we're in. That's whistle stop. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much
for that, Stuart.
Thanks for that, Nick. It's good to focus on some positives and those opportunities at the moment.
Definitely.
Brendan, I think I caught that your mic was unmuted. Are you around? Are you available?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Right, let me jump back.
I've changed from the computer to the iPad and it seems to work.
It's building up the tension, Brendan.
Yeah, give me the graveyard shift purposely, I think. Okay, just a quick look at how we can put together risk assessments, which we will need if we're going to carry on playing at all. So I'll look at creating a risk assessment and what's included in them, listing the activities, listing what the risks are, and listing who is at risk. We'll also briefly look at the hierarchy of controls, which are limited in volleyball, but there is a hierarchy of controls we should be looking at to either remove or reduce the risk that we've got in place. Next slide, please, Stuart. So again, we've mentioned before, we've always got to follow the government guidance, and that includes the Rule of 6. In a way, the Rule of 6 is the government's risk assessment, one of the controls they put in place. Sports centres and schools should have their own risk assessments, so ask for them, and they can form part of our own risk assessments that we'll look at in one of the later slides. But do ask for them, because we found generally that a lot of sports centres aren't making these readily available or haven't got them in place. I'd be surprised if they haven't had to put them together, really. So do ask for them. When we're doing our own risk assessments, keep them simple. It doesn't have to be a complicated document. In the industry I'm in, that's a problem that a lot of companies do, is make the risk assessments so complicated that the people who are actually using them at the end, at the coalface, don't end up reading them at all, because they're 30, 40 pages thick. So keep them nice and brisk, and they're more likely to be read and understood. And also, your risk assessments will need to be specific to the regional control levels now, the tier 1 to 3 levels. So we're going to have to be mindful of them when we're putting the risk assessments together. I talked about the different levels that we've got in there. Eliminating the risk altogether, that's difficult without cancelling the session altogether, really. So we've got to start looking at isolating the risks and separating the risks from the people. And again, the rule of 6 is basically designed to do this in all our life, really. So it's definitely there for volleyball as well. Look at putting engineering controls in, and engineering controls for volleyball, you're probably looking at physical curtains or screens. I know in the sitting volleyball, we've trialled nets with plastic coating on them, and that would, in the risk assessment criteria, that would be engineering controls to actually control and minimise the risk. And the last one there, when you put together the risk assessments, look at administrative controls, and they're basically making sure that whatever risk assessments, protocols that we've got in place, they're actually read and understood by the participants. Because again, a lot of time risk assessments are put in place and they stay on the shelf somewhere where no one actually reads or understands them. Make sure that anyone taking part in your sessions has seen the risk assessments, has seen the protocols, and more importantly, understand them as well. So you might have to walk them through them. And the last bit of the elements of control when you're doing the risk assessment is PPE. Personal protective equipment. Now, I don't really see that being part of for the actual participants in the sessions, but certainly a face covering for the coach would be something I'd advise to add in there. I think if you ask players to wear face coverings, you're probably increasing the risk as the face covering gets damp. But certainly for the coach, consider putting the face covering there as part of your mitigation process. Just looking at how we put the risk assessments together. Could you just read the next slide, Stuart, please? I think I'm missing one there. No, if you go back to the original one, it's cut off what I had. Oh, yeah, you're on a different side. If you look at the element on the left there, look at how we score the risks. You've got a low risk score of 1 to 6. Medium risk scores 8 to 10, and a high risk scores 12 to 25. And then what you list, and if you look on the risk assessment that's put together there, and this is similar to the ones that we've actually got on the website at the moment, list what the hazards are. So again, looking at the facilities and the equipment that we use, and how the virus can be transferred through the equipment. So you're looking at the balls, the baskets, aerials, the net. Start looking at that, looking at people. Then the next column, you're looking at who could be affected by this. So you're looking at the employees at the venue, the coaches, the players, and members of the public. Unlikely to be that we're going to be put together because they're not going to be allowed in the sports centres. And then you categorise them risks. Then so you've got the level of risk, the severity, and then the risk. There. So you do you times the level of risk by the severity of the risk, and then you get the risk level. And then in the next column, you look at your control measures. So by putting the control measures in place, you therefore should reduce the levels of risk that you've got in place there. So you can see from the scoring system, we started off with a risk level of 3, and by putting the control measures in place, that goes down to 2. Now, the severity is an interesting one as regards COVID, because it's difficult to reduce the severity of COVID if you've got COVID. But one way that we do reduce the severity is looking at the age groups of the people who are taking part in volleyball. So obviously, if you've got people who are over 60, 70 years of age taking part in volleyball, decreasing that level of severity is difficult. So just bear that in mind when you actually look at the scoring system there as well. So ideally, what you're looking at is to get that risk level down into the low category. So again, I've listed a couple of, sorry, just nip back again. I've just put in a couple of control measures there, cleaning and wiping down all the equipment with sanitizer before the session starts, having a limited number of balls for the overall, to reduce the overall risk of transfer, and also just use the essential equipment. I think it was mentioned in one of the earlier slides. Keep the number of balls you're using down to the bare minimum. So you know which balls are clean, and you know which balls are being transferred between or not transferred between bubbles, and make sure that you're putting part of your risk assessment that there be no transfer of people within each bubbles. Include all them in your control measures, and that will then reduce the risk. Next slide, please, Stuart. And again, it's similar there, but this is more in the action of playing rather than the equipment. So again, you're looking at the different types of actions of actually playing the sport and training the sport. And then again, you're scoring them like I mentioned in the previous slide. And then you a full list of control measures. And what's useful as well, if you're putting the risk assessment together, don't do it on your own, because many minds make this lighter work. Some people will think of extra risks and extra control measures. So involve the group in putting the risk assessment together and come up with as many control measures as you can. And by doing that, you can reduce the risk to an acceptable level. Okay, and just with risk assessments, ideally avoid the risk whenever possible. Carry out a risk assessment to evaluate the risks that cannot be avoided. Take action to reduce as low as reasonably practicable the levels of risk, and ensure that everyone involved reads the risk assessments. It's important with this, can't stress this enough really. It's all very well putting these together, but they're a useless document if they haven't been read by everyone who's taken part in the activity. So make sure that everyone has read them, has got access to them and has seen them. And again, going back to what part of your control measures, find out whether the venue where you're playing have got a risk assessment, have got their own controls, and refer to them in your control measures. So you're referring to and that brings their controls as part of your own controls then as well.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Brendan. I'm glad we got you back in there. So that brings us now to the final section, which is the opportunity to ask some questions. So I've seen a few have been dropped into the chat. I'll just pick up on a couple of them if that's okay, and then I'll go to a few people that got their hands up. So I believe it's Clayton in the chat. He's asked, and it's a question for you, Brendan. Is evidence required that admin controls have been put in place? For example, participants signing to say they have read and understood the risk assessment. Yes,
it would be. Yeah.
Nice, easy one to get us going. So this is going back to some of the earlier part of the presentation. Doody has asked, does the coach have to be part of a bubble of 6, or can they be a standalone? I assume they mean standalone bubble.
So the answer to that question, I think, is yes, there absolutely can be standalone, or if you've got multiple coaches, they can be a bubble of coaches.
Excellent. Another question from Clayton earlier on. Is there going to be dispensation for over 18 elite athletes, or at least is the question being asked?
Yeah, in terms of elite athletes, unfortunately, there's such a small number of athletes in our sport that meet the actual criteria that government set out. It's a very, very small number of beach athletes. I think it's about 4 or 5. That's it. The rest, unfortunately, are not considered to be elite under the government's criteria.
Another one just from earlier on the sessions from Julian. Is there any guidance on disinfecting nets if they've been used for junior or adult sessions?
wouldn't be aware of any.
No, I'm not. I'm not aware of any specific regulations or specific guidance around nets. I think we would refer you back to the manufacturer's guidance on how to clean a net. And I think it comes back to the point around transmission in the same way as we talk about it with the ball. Try not to handle it. Try and get very few people to handle nets, posts, etc. Clean them, sanitize them where possible. But you'd need to refer to the manufacturer's guidance on that, and that's perhaps something we can have a look at and see if we can dig out any information around cleaning of nets, and if so, we'll post some points on that.
Just to add to that conversation, when we were looking at things like cleaning of nets, it wasn't seen as a major risk factor that people don't often come into contact with a net, and even if they do come into contact with a net, because you are sanitizing your hands on a very regular basis, the risk of transmission becomes quite small. So although it's a good idea, it's a relatively low risk activity.
Thank you very much, both. William Garnett, would you like to ask a question? You should be able to unmute yourself and ask that question.
Hi there. Yeah, this is a question more from a university standpoint, and it's more of a confirmation, hopefully. There might be a follow-up question as well to it, but how do you guys I don't know who it's necessarily to, but how do you think it's going to work from a university standpoint? Obviously, you were allowed up to 30, and you recommend maybe using a slightly smaller number, which is something we're going to look to do. But would you still suggest that obviously at all times they maintain that 2 metre distance, or they work in groups of 6, or how would you go about it? I'd be interested to hear.
Do you want me to take that one?
Yes, please,
so I would absolutely say, if you think about what's going on in universities at the moment and the high degree of infection rates that are springing up around university students, clearly you want to do it as safely as you can. So as an absolute minimum, you should be looking to follow all of the guidelines that we've talked about for rules of 6. Although you're allowed to play, think about it. Is it really essential that you do that 6v6 gameplay? If you can get away without doing it, then maybe you should do that. What's really, really key in all of this is to do your risk assessment and make sure that you get yourself comfortable as coach and as players that whatever you're doing kind of gets you to the right point. I can't stress that enough. I've spoken to a few of the university coaches, and they're very much in that space of, we want to play volleyball, we want to do it safely. So we will look very carefully at all of the protocols to make sure we can do it as safely as we possibly can.
Any follow-up questions there, Will? Is that okay?
No, that's really helpful. Thank you very much.
Nicola, would you like to ask a question as well?
Yeah, so hello everybody. Somebody mentioned that the coach can be a standalone bubble, but then means that he cannot have any interaction with any balls, he cannot feed, he cannot explain position on the court. Is that correct?
Yeah, in terms of adult play,
adult playing, yes.
Yeah, the coach will be in a separate bubble and wouldn't be able to feed balls because balls cannot pass from one bubble to another.
Or I can be part of a bubble with 5 players and interact as I want, as I like.
Yes, that's quite right. Yes, if you're part of the 6, then you can interact with that bubble and feed the ball and play, etc. So,
okay.
Well, you couldn't play a game as such, but you would, managing the activity.
Managing the activities, let's say a bit more hands-on actively.
Yes.
Another one, if I have time, if possible. You have presented 2 possible configurations of 2 bubbles of 6 on court. One with, let's say, using the full length, let's say 18 meters times 3 with the net in the between, and 2 others with the net only as a separation between the bubbles. Can I change the configuration of my training starting with one and then move to the other, providing that the bubbles are not mixing?
Yes, absolutely. You know, if you look at the example that I kind of walked you through, there were multiple configurations that I used throughout the session. It's really just about thinking about keeping the 2 meters separation between the activities of the different bubbles.
Okay, thank you very much.
We've got a question in the chat from Attila. Would the same guidance apply for universities as the ones outlined for under 18 groups? I'm not sure. Do you want some more clarification on that question, or does that make sense?
Yes, please. Yeah. If you,
Attila, are you happy just to pop on and just help explain that question, if that's okay? If not, we'll move on to the one if it's okay, and I can come back to you.
No, sorry. The previous question clarified that relation to universities. Thank you.
No worries.
Okay.
Neil, you got a question you'd like to ask?
Yes, thank you for the very, very useful information in the webinar. I wanted to ask Nick about the Volley 2's pack. How is that going to be distributed?
Hello, we're still in the putting it together phase at the moment, and we're not quite sure how that is going to be rolled out. But obviously, it'll be through the website. I imagine we'll have the information on that. But hopefully, it's going to be out as soon as we can. We have been held up. I'm not really answering your question there because I don't know the full answer to that. But we're hoping to have some news on that pretty soon.
Yeah, we are hoping that it's a downloadable activity rather than not necessarily buying lots and lots of packs of cards and so on. It will be a downloadable.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Okay, that's great.
Excellent. Do we have any other questions then? I couldn't see any in the chat. I don't. Ooh.
Stuart, I had a question that came into me via text.
Okay.
Can you please ask the group for some explanation about bucks and the can and can't and can do and don't do? I think in a way we've sort of semi-answered that question in the last conversation about university. So yes, bucks do have an exemption. They're the university setting over 18's exemption for competition. Our recommendations would be, as I said before, to think very carefully about how you do that as safely as possible for your athletes, and just really apply all of the controls that you can to try and make sure you don't do it. I'd particularly probably be thinking about students of making sure that you're really tough on the pre-attendance checks for symptoms. Make sure they've done the temperature check, make sure they've got no continuous cough, make sure there's no loss of smell, make sure you're really keen to check that they do all of those things before every session. And if in doubt, don't attend the session. In terms of competition, I think probably the best place to get advice on what Bucks are planning to do is from the Bucks website itself. They'll be able to give you advice about what they're planning to do. If that doesn't answer the question, if you want to pop into chat or come online, then please do.
Excellent, thank you, James. Unless you've got any other questions on text there, I think that brings us to the end of the Q&A. I think
William, have you got another question, or was that a hand up from earlier?
Yeah, I have. Sorry, just a little bit of a red flag went off in my mind when you mentioned temperature checks there. Do you mean they do their sort of home screening of a temperature check, or is that a requirement that you want us to do a temperature check when they're entering the building?
No, it's very much a home temperature check. They shouldn't travel. They shouldn't leave the house without doing
a answer. Thank you. I'm just double checking. Cheers.
Excellent. Thank you very much, everyone. There's just a few final things just wanted to go through them before bringing a close to the presentation. The first thing, I've just popped the link into the chat. Oh, some more questions. I'll jump in after I've just made it one point, if that's okay, Sue. It's just some feedback. If you get 5 minutes today or tomorrow, it'd be really helpful if you can just fill out this very short survey. It's quite literally 6 questions. Help us find out how useful the session has been and how we can help you in sort of the days and weeks and months ahead of this. So that's my first thing, but I'll pause and I'll just jump back to the questions if that's okay. Sue, did you have a question you'd like to ask? Sue Souden? You should be able to unmute yourself, Sue. It should be on the bar on the top right.
Yeah.
Wicked. There we go.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Loud.
It was just we were just sort of discussing, because Kit's here with me as well, regarding the books thing that you've just mentioned, and saying if the books, the students are able to train at the moment, but in our area, our club teams can't, the adults. So it's going to put a very unfair advantage in the National League situation with the student teams.
Because obviously the likes of Sheffield, Durham University would be miles ahead of, let's say, Mallory or, that sort of scenario. But it's so far off, it doesn't really make too much difference at the moment.
No.
No,
Go on, James.
I totally understand that. I mean, I think, as you say, it's a long way away. We're now planning to see if we can start in January. That's our hope, that things will sort out, and these controls that they're putting in place will bring it back under control, and that we'll all drop back to tier 1, and competition can start. But as before, it won't be a question of just kind of leaping straight into competition on the 1st of January. We'll very much be looking at how do we make sure that we get people enough time to get back into training before we start the National League. So my best guess is it will be at least 4 weeks between the time that we announce that we're going to restart the competition and play going on. And you can then look at that and say, well, if you think about it, normally for a National League season, the 4 weeks that you would have before a National League season starts is the 4 weeks you'd have when this starts. So yes, you can argue that they played together, and instead of having their usual disadvantage because there's a bunch of new students who've never played together, at least they'll have had some chance to do so.
It's relative to the lower levels of regional league level as well. I mean, up here, we don't really have university teams playing in the regional leagues, but I'm sure in a lot of areas in the country they would have. So it would apply at the lower levels rather than at the top level as well.
Yes, and there's not much we can do about it. It's going to be down to each of the regional leagues and local leagues to think about what they want to do about those particular scenarios. I'm not sure that, as I say, quite often with the university teams, they tend to be scratch teams, and we see their improvement in the second half of the season. Perhaps we won't see that this year. That perhaps they'll start strong from the beginning of the season.
That's
okay,
fine.
Thanks.
Thank you. Nick Shaffery, have you got a question for the panel?
It's not a question, it's more back to Neil was asking about the Volley 2's resource. It'd be great if anybody who's interested in that, if they could email in. I think it's coaching at volleyballengland.org. Is that the address? So if you're interested in that, that would be great to email and just say that you're interested, a little bit about your background, just what's your interest and experience, because we want to try and link up with as many people when things are up and running as possible. So that'd be great. If sorry about that, Neil, I should have said that before, but if we can put that out on the minutes and bits and pieces as well, that'd be great to find who would be interested in that. That's brilliant. Thank you.
Kate, have you got another question you'd like to ask? Kate Faulkner.
Yes, please. I'm based in Wales, and if you have a scenario such as the following: a group of adults come from a low-risk area in England to come and play a group of adults in Wales in an area which isn't in lockdown. And in the government guidance in Wales is you can have groups of 30 still playing, irrespective of their age, so long as you're not in a lockdown area. What would happen there? You said that we're following government guidelines first. So can you tell me whether that would be possible?
Yeah, so Kate, that's a really good point, and something that has been mentioned by a few teams. Can they travel to a country that allows 6v6 play? And the answer is yes, you can, as long as you're not from a tier 3 area. So you could make money now by hiring out your facilities and your teams to teams who want to travel across to you and
she
play.
couldn't. Cardiff are on lockdown. She couldn't make any money.
We're not in the mountains though, Brendan, you know. Okay, so cool, brilliant. Thank you.
All tournaments in Wales then.
Yeah, here we go.
Okay, Dave Fox, have you got a question?
I have. It's just a follow up on the Bucks question. My lad is at university and he's very keen to get back into volleyball, but the question is, what sort of timescales are we looking at for resuming into university play?
Well, I think Alex Porter is on the call, and I think he made the point, which is absolutely valid, which is actually down to the universities. They're taking different approaches depending on where they are and what they're up to about what they are and aren't allowing. So again, I'm sorry, I can't give you a generic answer. You do need to refer back to the university and to Bucks as to what they're doing. My understanding, the last I saw from Bucks is that they were planning on restarting competition in January, and that competition from their Bucks kind of promotion relegation was going to be non-competitive. So there would be no promotion and relegation in Bucks this year, but January was when they were planning on starting. Now, my suspicion is that, like us, that's what they're hoping for, but they will look at conditions at that time and determine whether that's going to happen or not.
Excellent, thank you, James. I think that brings us to the end of the questions again. I've got a couple of points just to finish off on, and then if any other questions come in or you think of anything, we can jump back to them. So the first thing is just that at the moment we are looking to recruit a sort of passionate coach to become our new coach and lead. And if you're up for the challenge, I know there's many fantastic coaches out there, then please do get in touch with us. We'd love to hear from you, even if it's just sort of for an informal chat. It is such an important voluntary role for us, and it really helps to provide us some leadership in sort of the coaching landscape. So that's the first thing for me, and perfectly on cue, we've got some more questions. So David, would you like to ask away? David Spears, I think it's in on the chat there.
He's going to volunteer to be the coach lead, David.
No, I'm not.
No better man.
Thank you, Brendan. Yeah, we're actually nearly in total lockdown, just like Liverpool. My question really is, what's going to happen to the clubs that maybe not be able to get back in January? Things aren't looking good here in terms of the local facilities. Our particular hall is not allowing us in, but not only that, none of the sports centres are allowing any external bookings as well in our area.
All the universities.
All the universities. We've even tried the universities. They're not allowing any externals in either.
Yeah, and you're certainly not alone in facing those challenges. You know, this is a bit of a sort of shift in sand sort of situation. So we're trying our best to put forward a set of rules that will and restrictions that you can understand to be able to do something. And then you get all of that, and you're then faced with the challenge of trying to get a venue, and you cope with all of that, and then you've potentially got a group of people who might come along who are symptomatic and pull out. So this isn't easy for any of us, and how long is it going to last? It is almost impossible to say. Let's hope that once this second wave is over, we can start to get back to some sort of play and be able to return. We are certainly raising the issues nationally around venues and around the availability of venues, and trying to really keep that momentum going. There's a campaign about to start. You'll probably see it around safe sport that we've sort of signed up to and are part of. And we're looking for everybody to try and get some momentum in, putting pressure onto MPs and so on, so we can absolutely do what we can to save venues, save sports, and keep us active in the future. We really want to try and keep that momentum going.
And Dave, if your question was around the NVL specifically, then yes, that's very much at the forefront of our mind as well. It's quite likely, when we surveyed the clubs earlier as part of our consultation process, most clubs said that if we had a half season starting in January, that they would like it to be a no promotion and relegation. So that's quite likely. And also, as when we get to that point, as we did last time, we'll be asking the clubs to identify have they got venues and when have they got it and when they're likely to have it. And again, if it turns out that we're trying to organise some competition because we understand people want us to do so. But if it turns out that that's not going to be practical because half the country is still in lockdown and those that aren't in lockdown haven't got access to facilities, then that's what it will be.
Okay, thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So the last point from me then is just a reminder about coaching memberships. I know it's a really strange time we're in, but if you are able to continue training in some way, obviously coaching membership offers that sort of insurance cover for you as well as discounts such as the art of coaching and some other benefits. So just something to think about there if you haven't already renewed your membership. So I think it's sort of leave it with the last word with you then. I don't think we've got any more questions.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I reiterate what Stuart just said there. It is tough times, but it's particularly tough for us as the governing body trying to keep the lights on, frankly. So as well as those sort of benefits and the protection that you'll receive by having insurance, it does help us to try and keep the sport continuing into the future. So really, just as a bit of a wrap up from me, I want to say a massive thank you to Richard, James, Brendan, and Nick for their presentations, and of course to Stuart for pulling all of this together. He's done a fantastic job on keeping us all together. But my main thanks goes to all of you for your ongoing support and commitment to the sport. The coaches in this country are a huge and vital part of our volleyball family. And we certainly wouldn't be able to have the standards that we have in volleyball and the standards that we aim to have in the future if it wasn't for the commitment, the time, and everything that you guys give to the sport. So massive thank you from all of us and from me particularly for everything that you do to keep the sport going. And thank you for your ongoing commitment and time to be able to try and understand some of these challenges that we're all facing now, to make sure that we can sort of work our way through it. But we want to keep talking to you. We want to keep all these conversations going. We've done a few of these webinars now and they've been really useful. So we're happy to do more of these. So we give people the opportunity to have the conversation. But please talk to us. All our social media channels, our email, everything else is open, and we want to keep those conversations going. If you've got questions, ask them, and we'll try our best to answer them. So that's all from me for tonight. So just a massive thank you to everybody, and hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.